The morning of Friday, October 13, 1307, began like any other autumn day in medieval France. But as dawn broke across the countryside, an unprecedented operation was already in motion. Sealed orders distributed weeks earlier to royal officials throughout the kingdom were simultaneously opened. Their contents: instructions to arrest every member of the Knights Templar, a powerful military order that had served as Christianity's elite fighting force for nearly 2 centuries. In Paris, the elderly Grand Master Jacques de Molay was seized from his bed. In provincial commanderies, knights were dragged from their quarters. In village preceptories, sergeant brothers were clapped in irons. By nightfall, hundreds of Templars, men who had once been the defenders of Christendom, the guardians of pilgrims, and the shock troops of the Crusades, found themselves prisoners of the French crown, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and abominable practices. This coordinated strike, orchestrated by King Philip IV of France with the reluctant blessing of Pope Clement V, would initiate one of history's most notorious legal proceedings: the Templar trials. The official narrative, carefully cultivated by both church and crown in the centuries since, portrays these trials as a necessary purge of corruption from within the church's ranks, the righteous prosecution of a military order that had fallen into heresy and depravity. But this sanitized version conceals a far more complex and troubling truth. The story of the Templar trials is not merely about religious orthodoxy or moral corruption. It is a tale of political calculation, financial greed, and the brutal exercise of power. It reveals how the mechanisms of medieval justice could be weaponized against even the most powerful institutions when they stood in the way of royal ambition. And perhaps most disturbingly, it demonstrates how the church, supposedly the moral compass of medieval society, could be manipulated into serving as an instrument of secular authority. What follows is the story that official church histories have been reluctant to tell in full, a narrative of conspiracy, torture, and injustice that would forever alter the landscape of medieval Europe and create enduring mysteries that continue to fascinate us 7 centuries later. To understand why the Templars became targets, we must first comprehend what they had become by the dawn of the 14th century. Their humble origins gave little hint of the power they would eventually wield. Founded in 1119 by Hugh de Payens and a small band of knights, the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, as they were formally known, began with a simple mission: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Initially so poor they shared horses and wore donated clothing, they received official recognition from the Church at the Council of Troy in 1129 and were granted a rule written by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the era. Over the following decades, the Templars transformed from a small band of dedicated protectors into something unprecedented: a transnational organization with its own territories, fleet, diplomatic corps, and banking system. By the early 14th century, they had become medieval Europe's first multinational corporation. Their financial innovations were particularly revolutionary. Pilgrims and crusaders could deposit funds at a Templar house in Europe and withdraw equivalent funds in the Holy Land via letters of credit, an early precursor to modern banking. This system not only facilitated safer travel for pilgrims, but also generated enormous wealth for the order. Kings, nobles, and merchants began using Templar financial services. The Paris Temple became the treasury for the French monarchy, and the London Temple served a similar function for the English crown. The Templars' landholdings were vast, comprising thousands of manors, farms, churches, and mills spread across Europe and the Middle East. Their fleet of ships controlled important Mediterranean trade routes. They answered only to the Pope, exempt from local taxes and oversight. Their members were drawn from the nobility, but took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, meaning their collective wealth belonged not to individuals, but to the order itself. This combination of wealth, military prowess, and independence made the Templars uniquely powerful. They could transfer vast sums across borders when kings could not. They could field armies when needed. They could influence policy through their network of houses that stretched from England to Cyprus. And critically, they operated largely outside the control of secular rulers, answerable only to Rome. For ambitious monarchs like Philip IV of France, struggling with debt and determined to centralize power, the Templars represented both a temptation and a threat. Their wealth could solve Philip's financial problems, while their autonomy undermined his authority within his own kingdom. As one contemporary chronicler noted, they had become a state within a state, and in the emerging world of nation-states, this was a dangerous position to occupy. What the church histories often gloss over is just how dependent the French crown had become on Templar financial services. By 1307, Philip IV was deeply indebted to the order, having borrowed heavily to finance his wars against England and Flanders. The Paris Temple had served as royal treasury, bank, and occasional residence for the king. The Templars had even helped protect Philip from rioters during a currency devaluation crisis in 1306, sheltering him in their fortified Paris headquarters. This financial entanglement would prove fatal for the order. For Philip, the Templars represented not just a rival power center, but also his largest creditor, a debt that could be conveniently erased if the order itself were destroyed. The arrests on Friday, October 13, 1307, a date that would later give rise to superstitions about Friday the 13th, were unprecedented in their scope and coordination. Royal officials across France opened sealed orders simultaneously and descended on Templar properties before dawn. The knights, caught completely by surprise, offered virtually no resistance. What makes this operation particularly remarkable is its secrecy. Planning such a kingdom-wide action would have required months of preparation, yet no warning reached the Templars. This suggests both the efficiency of Philip's royal administration and perhaps the complicity of informants within the order itself. The charges leveled against the Templars were designed to shock medieval sensibilities. Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief minister and architect of the arrests, produced a list of accusations that included denying Christ and spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, engaging in homosexual practices as part of their rituals, exchanging obscene kisses during ceremonies, wearing cords that had touched the idol, granting absolution for sins despite not being priests. These charges were carefully crafted to position the Templars not merely as criminals, but as heretics of the worst sort, practitioners of systematic blasphemy who had betrayed their sacred oaths as defenders of the faith. What the official church narrative has consistently downplayed is how closely these accusations mirrored those used in other politically motivated persecutions of the era. Just a few years earlier, Philip had employed similar tactics against Pope Boniface VIII, accusing him of heresy, black magic, and sexual impropriety. The king had also used accusations of sorcery and financial corruption to expel Jews from France in 1306, conveniently allowing him to seize their assets. The charges against the Templars followed this established template for eliminating opponents and appropriating their wealth. The testimonies obtained in the immediate aftermath of the arrests were devastating. Under torture, many Templars, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, confessed to some or all of the charges. These confessions were immediately publicized by royal officials, creating a sensation throughout Christendom. Within days, Philip had written to other European monarchs, urging them to follow his example and arrest Templars in their domains. But a closer examination of the evidence reveals troubling inconsistencies. The confessions, while numerous, were remarkably inconsistent in their details. Some knights admitted to spitting on crosses, others to trampling them. Some described elaborate idol worship, while others mentioned nothing of the sort. This pattern suggests not the uncovering of actual practices, but rather confused responses from men under extreme duress, attempting to satisfy their torturers with whatever seemed plausible. The methods used to extract these confessions were brutal, even by medieval standards. Templars were subjected to the strappado, being hung by the arms tied behind the back, often dislocating shoulders. The chevalet, a pointed wooden horse that victims straddled with weights attached to their feet, and perhaps most commonly, having the soles of their feet coated with fat and held over flames, a technique that caused excruciating pain without leaving visible marks. The effectiveness of these methods is evident in the testimony of John de Coquilhac, who later recanted his confession, stating, "I would have admitted to killing God himself under such torture." When Pope Clement V later established his own commission to investigate the charges, allowing Templars to testify without royal officials present, hundreds recanted their confessions, explaining they had admitted to impossible crimes only to escape unbearable pain. One knight showed commissioners the bones that had fallen from his feet after they had been burned during interrogation. What emerges from a clear-eyed examination of the arrest records is not evidence of widespread heresy, but rather the systematic application of torture to manufacture a case against an order that had become politically inconvenient and financially attractive to the French crown. Behind the public spectacle of religious prosecution lay a complex web of political and financial motivations that church histories have consistently minimized. At the center of this web was King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, a monarch whose reign was characterized by fiscal crises, centralizing reforms, and increasingly bold assertions of royal power against traditional authorities. By 1307, Philip was facing a perfect storm of financial problems. His wars against England and Flanders had drained the royal treasury. Multiple attempts at currency manipulation had triggered inflation and public unrest. His taxation of the French clergy had led to a direct confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII, culminating in the Pope's humiliation at Anagni in 1303, and his death shortly thereafter. Though Philip had secured the election of a more pliable French pope in Clement V, the king's fiscal situation remained dire. The Templars represented a solution to these problems on multiple levels. First, they were immensely wealthy. Conservative estimates suggest the order controlled assets equivalent to billions in today's currency, with substantial cash reserves, gold, and movable wealth. Second, they were Philip's creditors, holding substantial royal debt that would be effectively cancelled if the order were dissolved. Third, as an autonomous international organization answerable only to the Pope, they represented a challenge to Philip's vision of centralized royal authority within France. What makes the timing particularly suspicious is that Jacques de Molay, the Templar Grand Master, had arrived in France in 1307, believing he was there to discuss a new crusade with the king. Instead, he found himself arrested on charges that had apparently been in preparation for months, if not years. De Nogaret, the royal prosecutor who orchestrated the arrests, had a documented history of fabricating charges against Philip's enemies, having led the campaign of defamation against Pope Boniface VIII that included accusations remarkably similar to those later leveled against the Templars. Pope Clement V's role in this affair reveals the compromised position of the papacy during this period. Installed as pope largely through Philip's influence, Clement was a French pope who never set foot in Rome, establishing his court at Avignon, effectively under the shadow of French power. His initial reaction to the Templar arrests was one of outrage, viewing Philip's action as an infringement on papal authority, since only the Pope had jurisdiction over the order. In a letter dated November 27, 1307, Clement suspended the inquisitorial proceedings against the Templars, asserting papal prerogative. Philip's response was swift and threatening. Royal propagandists began questioning Clement's commitment to rooting out heresy, while French legal scholars drafted arguments asserting the king's duty to act against heretics when the church failed to do so. Faced with this pressure, and perhaps fearing a fate similar to Boniface VIII's, Clement eventually capitulated. On November 22, 1307, he issued the bull Pastoralis Preeminentiae, ordering the arrest of Templars throughout Christendom, effectively legitimizing Philip's actions after the fact. Later, with the bull Fesciens Misericordiam in August 1308, he established procedures for trying the Templars that preserved a veneer of papal authority while allowing the proceedings to continue. This political capitulation has been obscured in official church histories, which tend to portray Clement as exercising independent judgment rather than bending to royal pressure. In reality, the Pope found himself caught between his duty to protect a religious order under his direct authority and the political necessity of accommodating a powerful king who had already demonstrated his willingness to use force against papal authority. The financial outcome of the suppression makes the political motives even clearer. While the official papal dissolution of the order in 1312 decreed that Templar assets should be transferred to the Hospital of St. John, the Knights Hospitaller, the reality in France was quite different. Philip extracted enormous expenses for having housed and fed Templar prisoners for years. Royal officials systematically looted Templar treasuries immediately following the arrests. By the time the Hospitallers received what remained of Templar properties in France, they found themselves inheriting massive debts rather than wealth. Contemporary chroniclers noted the discrepancy between the supposed religious motives and the obvious financial benefits to the crown. As one observed, the king took the money for himself, and all their goods were confiscated for his use. Even Pope Clement eventually complained that he did not know what had happened to the Templar treasure from Paris, a telling admission of how completely Philip had outmaneuvered the papacy in this affair. The legal proceedings against the Templars spanned 7 years and unfolded across multiple jurisdictions, creating a complex tapestry of testimonies, retractions, and judicial manipulations that defies simple interpretation. What emerges from a careful examination, however, is a pattern of procedural abuse designed to ensure a predetermined outcome. The initial phase of interrogations conducted by French royal officials and inquisitors between October 1307 and February 1308 produced hundreds of confessions. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, initially admitted to spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies. Other high-ranking officials made similar confessions. These admissions, extracted under torture, formed the foundation of the case against the order. What church histories often gloss over is what happened when the initial phase of royal-controlled interrogations gave way to papal commissions established to conduct a more thorough investigation. When Templars were permitted to speak before papal commissioners without the immediate threat of torture, a dramatically different picture emerged. In April 1310, a group of 546 Templars came forward to defend the order before the Papal Commission in Paris. They denied all charges of heresy and blasphemy, explaining that their earlier confessions had been extracted through torture. Their spokesman, Pierre de Bologna, a priest and Templar procurator, presented a sophisticated legal defense challenging both the procedures and the substance of the accusations. This defense represented a crisis for Philip's carefully orchestrated prosecution. His response was swift and brutal. Working through the Archbishop of Sens, a royal appointee and brother of one of Philip's chief ministers, the king arranged for 54 Templars who had recanted their confessions to be condemned as relapsed heretics and burned at the stake on May 12, 1310. This mass execution, deliberately conducted during a temporary adjournment of the Papal Commission, sent an unmistakable message to any Templar considering a defense: recant your confession and face the flames. The Papal Commissioners, upon reconvening, found that the remaining Templars were now too terrified to continue any organized defense. Pierre de Bologna himself mysteriously disappeared from prison, never to be seen again. This intimidation tactic represents one of the most egregious procedural abuses in the trials, yet it is often minimized in traditional church accounts. The 54 Templars executed that day died not because evidence had proven them guilty, but because they had dared to proclaim their innocence and the innocence of their order. The transcripts of the Papal Commission hearings reveal other troubling patterns. Templars who maintained their innocence often reported specific details of their torture. John de Paulincourt described how he had been tortured 3 times and kept in a cold underground prison for 36 weeks. Ponsard de Gizy testified that 3 men in his group had died from torture. Bernard de Vado showed commissioners the scars on his hands where his fingernails had been torn out. Perhaps most revealing is the geographical pattern of confessions. In regions where torture was applied vigorously, such as France, confessions were abundant. In areas where torture was used sparingly or not at all, such as England, Germany, and parts of Spain, virtually no Templars confessed to heretical activities. In Cyprus, where the Templars had their headquarters after the fall of Acre, a thorough investigation found no evidence whatsoever of heretical practices. This discrepancy strongly suggests that the confessions were products of torture rather than truth. As one Templar, Aymon de Barbin, testified, "If 3 more days of torture had been threatened, I would have confessed to killing God himself." One document that church histories have long overlooked or actively suppressed is the Chinon parchment, rediscovered in the Vatican's secret archives in 2001. This document reveals that in August 1308, Pope Clement IV's representatives secretly absolved Jacques de Molay and other Templar leaders of the charges of heresy. The Pope apparently concluded that while certain improper practices might have occurred in some Templar initiation ceremonies, such as spitting near a cross as a test of obedience, these did not constitute actual heresy. This papal absolution, however, did not stop the proceedings against the order. Political pressure from Philip forced Clement to continue the process while finding a compromise solution. That solution eventually came with the papal bull Vox in Excelso, issued on March 22, 1312, which dissolved the Templar order not through condemnation, but through administrative fiat. Significantly, the bull stated that the Pope was acting not by definitive sentence, but by apostolic provision or ordinance, effectively acknowledging that the charges had not been conclusively proven. This careful legal distinction has been blurred in subsequent church histories, which often imply that the Templars were definitively found guilty of the charges. In reality, the order was dissolved without a formal verdict on the charges. A face-saving compromise that allowed Philip to achieve his goal of eliminating the Templars, while permitting Clement to avoid explicitly endorsing what many, even then, recognized as a travesty of justice. The final act of the Templar tragedy played out on a small island in the Seine River in Paris on March 18, 1314. There, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, and Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, were led to a slow execution by fire. Both men had previously confessed to charges under torture, then recanted, then confessed again under renewed pressure. But on this final day, knowing death was imminent, they shocked onlookers by proclaiming the innocence of the order and the falsity of the charges against it. De Molay, according to multiple chroniclers, addressed the crowd with unexpected vigor for a man in his 70s who had endured years of imprisonment and torture. I think it only right that at so solemn a moment when my life has so little time to run, I should reveal the deception which has been practiced and speak up for the truth. Before heaven and earth and all of you here as my witnesses, I admit that I am guilty of the grossest iniquity. But the iniquity is that I have lied in admitting the disgusting charges laid against the order. I declare, and I must declare, that the order is innocent. Its purity and saintliness are beyond question. As the flames began to consume him, de Molay is said to have called out a curse on both King Philip and Pope Clement, summoning them to meet him before God's judgment within the year. This detail, often dismissed as legend, gained credibility when both Philip and Clement indeed died unexpectedly within months of the execution. Clement from a chronic illness in April 1314, and Philip from a stroke while hunting in November of the same year. The deaths of both king and pope before the year added a seemingly supernatural dimension to the Templar story, fueling centuries of speculation about divine retribution. Philip's direct male line also died out within 14 years, with all three of his sons reigning briefly and dying without male heirs, a circumstance that plunged France into the 100 Years' War. The aftermath of the Templar suppression revealed the practical political outcomes that official histories have tended to minimize. In theory, the Templars' extensive properties were to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order. In practice, the crown extracted enormous administrative fees that left the Hospitallers with heavily encumbered assets in France. In England, Edward II initially resisted the persecution, but eventually complied with the papal dissolution, while similarly ensuring that the crown benefited financially from the process. Perhaps most tellingly, the immense Templar treasury in Paris, which included not only the order's wealth, but also deposits from nobles, merchants, and even the royal family, seemed to vanish. While Philip seized the Paris temple and its contents immediately after the arrests, contemporary records suggest that the expected windfall never materialized in royal accounts. This has led to speculation ranging from secret removal of the treasure before the arrests to misappropriation by royal officials, to the possibility of a hidden Templar contingency plan that modern historians have yet to uncover. The suppression of the Templars also had profound institutional repercussions for the Church. The episode demonstrated the growing power of secular monarchies relative to papal authority, particularly in France. The subsequent Avignon papacy, during which 7 consecutive French popes ruled from French territory rather than Rome, further cemented the impression that the papacy had become subordinate to French royal interests. For surviving Templars outside France, the aftermath varied dramatically. In Portugal, the order was simply renamed the Order of Christ and continued much as before. In Aragon, Many Templars were integrated into other military orders. In Germany, most were absolved and allowed to live out their lives in other monastic communities. This inconsistent implementation of the papal dissolution further undermines the notion that the suppression was primarily motivated by genuine religious concerns. The Templar legacy lived on in other ways as well. Their innovative financial techniques were adopted by Italian banking families. Their military expertise influenced later chivalric orders, and perhaps most enduringly, their suppression created a template for conspiracy theories that continues to resonate in popular culture. What church histories have been particularly reluctant to acknowledge is how the Templar trials established a dangerous precedent for the use of torture and manipulated evidence in prosecuting alleged heretics. The methods deployed against the Templars, secret accusations, torture-induced confessions, denial of adequate defense, would be replicated in subsequent centuries during the worst excesses of witch hunts and heresy trials. The story of the Templar trials reveals far more about medieval power politics than about religious heresy. When we strip away the layers of justification and examine the evidence with clear eyes, what emerges is not the suppression of a corrupt order, but rather the calculated destruction of a wealthy, autonomous institution that had become inconvenient to an ambitious king. Pope Clement V's complicity, however reluctant, represents one of the darker compromises in church history. Caught between his responsibility to protect an order under his direct authority and his political vulnerability to French pressure, Clement chose a path that preserved the papacy's short-term security at the expense of justice and truth. The papal bull dissolving the order employed a careful legal formulation that avoided directly endorsing the charges while still giving Philip his desired outcome, a political solution that sacrificed the Templars to maintain an increasingly fragile balance of power. What makes this episode particularly significant is how thoroughly the Church's subsequent historical accounts have obscured the political dimensions of the affair. Official histories have emphasized the charges of heresy while minimizing the financial motivations, procedural abuses, and papal compromises that define the actual events. Even the Chinon parchment, showing that Clement had privately absolved the Templar leaders, remained buried in Vatican archives until its rediscovery in 2001, suggesting a centuries-long reluctance to confront this uncomfortable chapter. The Templar suppression offers a sobering case study in how institutions can reshape historical narratives to minimize their own culpability. By emphasizing religious justifications and downplaying political motives, the official narrative transforms a story of injustice and institutional failure into one of necessary purification, a narrative far more palatable to an institution that claims moral authority. For modern observers, the Templar trials raise uncomfortable questions about the relationship between truth, power, and justice that remain relevant today. How easily can legal systems be manipulated by those in power? How readily can false confessions be manufactured through coercion? How completely can historical narratives be shaped to serve institutional interests? Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Templars lies not in the conspiracy theories they have inspired, but in the unresolved questions their suppression forces us to confront about the nature of justice itself. Jacques de Molay's final words, proclaiming the order's innocence as flames consumed him, echo across 7 centuries as a testament to the human cost when political expediency triumphs over truth. In the end, what the Church won't tell you about the Templar trials is not just a story of medieval intrigue, but a timeless warning about the fragility of justice when confronted with the combined forces of greed, power, and institutional self-preservation. a warning as relevant in our time as it was in 1307.